So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. We are joining today for our dialogue with the author on the Taos Institute's Dialogue with the Author series. This day is about the section 4, which is organizational development practices from the SAGE Handbook of Social Constructionist Practice. So we're really excited to be here and welcome all of you from around the world. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization. Our mission is to bring together scholars and practitioners concerned with social processes that are essential for the construction of reason, knowledge, and human value, and their appreciation and application in relational collaborative practices. And through the constructionist theory and practice, we locate the source of meaning, value, and action in the relational connection among people. And it is through this relational process that we create the world in which we most want to live. So today's conversation is about organizational life and how together through our relational practice, a relational process, we create the world that we want to live in. The Taos Institute has programs such as the diploma program, workshops, courses, conferences, book publications, webinars, and a lot more. So if you're not familiar with the Taos Institute, I invite you to visit our website and just take a look at everything that we have going on and all the manuscripts and offerings that we have on our website. Today is, as I said, section 4 of the handbook, Organization Development Practices. Diana Whitney is the section editor for this section. She is co-founder of the Taos Institute, and she hosted the very first Taos Institute conference in 1993 in Taos, New Mexico. Diana is the founder of the Corporation for Positive Change. She's a consultant, author, speaker, and has worked with thousands of organizations and people around the world, forging a positive revolution that is radically transforming knowledge, understanding, and practices in human organizing, leadership, and management for the good of all people. And I'm going to turn it over to Diana now to introduce the program.
Thank you, Dawn. I have to remember whenever I'm having a kind of bad, punky day, I'm going to call you and ask you to read that introduction of me to remind me of who I am. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all today. Dawn, I have a sign in the middle of my picture that says you have spotlighted me. Does that remain on? Okay, we'll go from there. I want to talk briefly about the significance of this particular chapter because as all of the section authors, I'm particularly partial to this section. I have been doing organization development consulting for probably close to 40 years now. I began in the 80s, and during that time, I was in dialogue with particularly Ken and Mary Gergen and talking about organization development and social construction. My practice, because my field is communication, was from a social constructionist point of view, which meant that I was always looking at the meaning-making processes in organization, much more so than the personal traits, much more so than the behaviors or what we now call strengths of people. I'm always interested in what are those processes? How are people relating in ways that give them meaning and together create a sense of authority in their life. Also, I'm very interested in words and language, the communication focus at the heart of social constructionism. So when, through our conversations, Ken and Mary, Sheila McNamee, who I saw on the call, Harleen Anderson, David Cooper-Ryder, Suresh Srivastava, we said, what if we have a conference and we highlight social constructionist practices? And we said, what if we invite organizational consultants, family therapists, and of course, educators? What if we came together to explore overlaps? What questions are we asking? What practices are we experimenting with? What theories are we drawing upon? So that was one of the founding impedi for the Taos Institute. What's really exciting to me now is that in the handbook, here we have it, it's kind of come to fruition to this point in time. This particular handbook and this section brings an awful lot together. And in this section, you'll see that some of the chapters are about the interactions among people within organizations. You're going to hear about coaching, leading, teamwork, and then you're going to hear some chapters presented in which people address the organization as a whole as a communication phenomena. And so that's part of what's really exciting in this chapter. We have both chapters about the practices within organizations and the chapters on the practices about organizing as a social constructionist act. I want to read you from the introduction of the chapter. The context of organization development practice has changed dramatically as the modern era of industrialization veered toward postmodernism, the digital information age, and globalization. Now we can also add post-pandemic, fingers crossed, and all of the things that are going on. But the vision of progress has pivoted into a loud global wake-up call for sustainability, widespread challenges to authoritarian leadership and bureaucratic organizing. They have emerged with masses of people inside and outside of organizations on the street demanding to have a voice in their own futures. And so what you will hear as you hear the presentations from these authors are the many ways in which social constructionist practices, the leaders, the consultants that use them, bring people together with each other to create their own futures, to give people voices in their futures. The way that we are going to approach this session, you're going to hear from an author, and then that author will be asked a question or in some way responded to by one of the other authors. We are hoping, again, fingers crossed, that there will be time for Q&A at the end. We've planned it, and as you know, the best laid plans will always work out, right? So if you have questions, write them in the chat box. I see our chat box is filled with wonderful messages of hello, good afternoon from Belgium, the Netherlands, the Rocky Mountains, Calgary, Oxford, Houston. The world is here today, and that's quite exciting. So if you have questions, write them in the chat box. We will come back to your questions during a question and answer period toward the end. And I'm going to ask you to listen for something specific. I'd like you to listen to what are the keys of a successful organization development activity, episode, intervention based on social constructionism. What do you hear in these presentations? And then you can also put that in the chat or send it to me in an email, because I'm sure Jervis is going to want to hear all this. And I'll share it with all of the other authors. So questions in the chat, listen for what are you finding as themes and keys to success. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of one of the chapters. Gita Haslebo, who is the director of her consulting firm, Haslebo and Partners in Denmark, couldn't be with us today. But her chapter is one, I think, of importance because it clearly demonstrates how to move from focus on individualism to systemic meaning making. It's a really lovely chapter, and in it, she tells the story of a service manager who has a habit of interrupting conversations. In fact, he's described as erupting. And of course, everyone else in the department points the finger at him. It's easy for them. He's at fault. So much so that the manager is ready to fire this person. Now, Gita was called in to be a consultant to them. And as the case for so many of us who do consulting, we walk into those kind of fiery situations. And she wondered, how can I help them see that maybe it's not about one person, it's actually about who they are as a system. Her chapter is called Relational Ethics in Organizational Life. And it is, as I said, a very clear story of how she consulted. She shares her first meeting with them, how she listened to their narrative about the fault belonging to that person. And then she shares the story of how she met with them later and they went, aha, I see my part. I now see that, of course, I saw the early warning signs of an eruption. And I could have just said, hey, what can I do to support you? How can I listen better so you don't have to erupt? And so from her chapter, the concept of moral obligation is a relational concept describing qualities in relationships and the interconnectedness among people and stories. What is interesting to note is that moral obligations do not reside in individual participants. They are brought alive in the dialogic processes being co-created by the consultant, the technical director, and the managers. So you see, she puts herself as a consultant in the dialogue. From a constructionist point of view, the moment we enter a system, we begin talking to them, we are part of the meaning making of that system. The participants did not first receive teaching in social constructionist concepts and relational ethics. They were just invited to practice new ways. And you'll also hear that throughout the chapters. Many of us who are working with organizations as consultants just get to work. We don't do the teaching about the constructionist principles that people have the luxury to do in the universities, quite frankly. We just embed them in the way we work. So highly recommend this chapter. The second chapter that we're going to discuss is called Working with Relational Leading and Meaning Making in Teams of Leaders by Lonnie Hirst. Now, Lonnie is a professor in the Department of Culture and Learning, also in Denmark, and she's written a very notable book on relational leading, which is the focus of her work. Lonnie is now going to do a brief presentation on her work for us. Lonnie.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. Actually, the idea of relational leading, the book I wrote together with Gergen around 10 years ago, was based on a series of workshops we did at different seminars and conferences with managers and consultants and family therapists. And because I have a background in theater and consultancy, we found it interesting to combine our knowledge and experience, and we created this series of workshops with these people and developed a kind of, you can say, practice or inquiry for how can we work with people in order to develop relational and dialogical skills. So that resulted in the book Relational Leading in 2011, and actually, I found this phenomenon very so interesting that I actually wrote a PhD thesis about relational leading, and it was submitted in 2016. And since then, I have been working on this theme in many different ways, also combining, working with it also as a consultant and as an action researcher, actually. So the chapter for the SAGE Handbook is about relational leading as a phenomenon. How can we understand it? And it's also about an example from practice where I work with a group of 7 managers or leaders from a vocational school. And they are in a period of huge organizational change, and they asked me to help them in how can they facilitate and engage in dialogues with the employees about difficult subjects. And so they were in this kind of difficult situation, how to handle difficult and situations that were loaded with tensions and could lead to conflicts. So I asked them, okay, would you be interested in working with this from a kind of role-playing approach? Could we try to do some experiments and play it out and play with it? And they said, okay, let's do that. So we started working with different kind of role-playing settings that were created by themselves. They came up with different situations in which they found themselves stuck, and so we work with different kinds of scenarios, and how can we transform a difficult situation into a more, you can say, more generative scenario, if we should use a word from Ken Gergen. So how can we make these situations more, how can we find conversational openings in the situation? And we work with a reflecting team. So the other managers around were taking different perspectives, looking at the scenario, which was enacted out by the managers themselves. And my role was actually just as a kind of facilitator, trying to help them in the process. And they actually came up with many different ways of engaging in these kind of conversations. And it helped them to go out afterwards and try it out in you can say reality, or So so the chapter actually explains this case and example. Yeah. I don't know if the 4 minutes have gone.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah. Yes.
So there were a couple of things. This chapter so beautifully shows how there are many different perspectives and so many different ways to look at any situation, and many different ways to relate into it. The way you've used the scenarios and showed people is just wonderful. My question is, you use the term, you say, when we use the term discourse, we also include the embodied dimensions of communication. Could you say a little more about that? What do you mean by embodied dimensions, and why is that important?
Yeah. Yes, when we do role playing, we engage with our whole system. You can say our body, our mind, our feelings, everything, and we can start noticing our own bodily feelings or sensations within the conversation, and we can learn from that. John Schotter says something about that we have to listen to our bodily reactions or sensations, and as well notice how do other people react and give bodily or physical responses to the situation. We can learn so much, and this kind of training or practice is also about sensitizing people in reading and how can we be awake in relationships and be responsive in the moment and be open towards what's actually happening. So the communication is not only through words, of course, it's a more complex practice. Yeah.
I mean, it hits that note in your chapter of the multiplicity of ways of knowing, multiplicity of perspectives, the multiplicity of myself. I can be thinking, but I'm feeling, and am I sensitive to what I'm experiencing? I love your chapter. It's clear and complex both. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say to close up your section?
Oh, many things. I think relational leading as a research field is very broad and complex. And of course, in this chapter, I give my account of relational leading, my perspective. And I think it's a research field that can be developed and taken further. And I hope also that in the Taos community, we can continue this dialogue about relational leading.
Thank you, because that's a beautiful segue then into our next presenter, Jenny Charles Belden. And Jenny, in fact, had been on the board of the Taos Institute. I think she's emeritus or something like that these days. But she also was the head of our master's in relational leading. She is an organization consultant who, for me, lives and breathes and invites others into relational organizing and relational leading. Jenny is going to share her chapter, Designing Relationally Responsive Organizations, and then Jervis will join her for question and dialogue.
Thanks, Diana. I wanted to start by saying that I too have been doing organization development work for many years. And in fact, I started my early work in organization development more than 30 years ago in organization design. And so this chapter was an opportunity for me and two of my colleague clients that I've worked with for over 10 years to put into perspective an evolving and changing perspective that we've had in the way that we build organization capacity and the way that we do organization development. And so the chapter is called Designing Relationally Responsive Organizations. And so if you think about, one way to think about organizations is just to imagine all the many interactions that happen in one day in any given organization, all the meetings and all the conversations and the information sharing and decision making and so forth that goes on. And a question that comes to mind is, how effective are those interactions in responding to the needs and conditions that the organization faces? And in the traditional or the way that we thought about organization design from maybe a functionalist kind of perspective is that we focused on analyzing work tasks and processes and defining sort of work outputs, and then sought alignment across all the various systems within the organization. And it was almost like we could architect a kind of well-oiled machine. So that machine metaphor was really, really strong in designing organizations. But in our work, looking at this through a relational constructionist lens, we instead shifted that view to one of the organization as a relational network that has a complex interplay between organization members and the systems they work with, and that's unfolding through space and time, in a sort of continuously emergent sort of way. And if we think about organization that way, then relating, it really becomes a central organizing activity. And we then began to focus on the responsiveness of those relational interactions to meet the organization's changing needs and conditions. And so how do we then, the question is, how do we design explicitly practices for how we work together? So not just designing the what of the work, or maybe the purpose or the why of the work, the mission, but how do we explicitly design practices for how we work together, so that we can become much more conscious in building organization skill and capability around relational work. So the practices that we identify in this chapter are illustrated by stories that were out of the experience that we did at Allied Media Projects. And it is a network organization that's growing rapidly, started in Detroit. It's very diverse, has members all over the world now. And as we looked at that, we identified 6 practices that the organization has been consciously implementing to build its capacity to be responsive to its organization members and to the communities that they serve. And so the 6 practices really quickly are belonging, how we help people feel welcome and a sense of belonging, how we invite the whole self in, practices around listening and meaning making, how we surface and address and resolve deep differences, and a practice on collective reflexivity, or how people can work together in a reflexive way so that they can begin to look at what's happening in their relationship and examine how they're seeing that as they go. And I think I might have hit my 4 minutes, so I'm going to actually, Gervais, I'm going to invite you in to see if there are any thoughts or questions you might have of this. You're on mute.
Thanks, Jenny. First, I want to say I found your chapter quite inspiring, and I think other people as well. And, here in the West, we've been trying to build relationally responsive organizations for about 40 years and having, a lot of challenge. And, as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, the case there is about a kind of an association, a network organization, and you got to wonder how much that lends itself, just by the nature of the organization, its mission, to developing relationally responsive forms of organizing. And, living in Detroit, like I worked in the auto industry, like kind of contrast. What are the opportunities there? And what do you think about that?
It's a good question, because I think our experience in a network really did, there was really compelling need and purpose, and it was built into the foundation of the organization. So it was a great place to experience and to really develop this. But what I see in other organizations today is that more and more work is happening in networked ways. So even hierarchical organizations are not doing their work solely, in a vacuum of just themselves and their own hierarchies. They're having to interact in a huge variety of ways, and they're seeing the importance of this. And so I think there's much to be learned, and they may not be the leaders, in my opinion, of that kind of work, but I think they have a lot of, I think there's a lot of need, and I think there's a growing awareness of that need. I also think that what's happening in the world today, with both the pandemic, with the sort of what people are calling the twin pandemic of racism that is becoming exposed, around certainly the US and the world, that this need to work differently from a relational perspective is becoming, becoming huge. So I'm seeing it grow more and more, actually.
I'm not sure what the timing is on this, Diana. Are you going to come in and?
I think it's time to move on. Thank you for asking. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jervis. I'm now going to introduce Renee Bowen, and it's just an absolute delight to introduce Renee. He has been involved with the Taos Institute, I think, from the absolute beginning. Came to our first conference in Taos. Renee is a faculty at the Leuven University in Belgium, and the director of the Center for Organizational and Personal Psychology. Renee has a sort of magical capacity for pulling together teams. I benefited, it's probably one of the most memorable conferences I've ever attended, Renee, was the conference when you and your team hosted us, the Taos Institute at Leuven, and we explored polyphonic meaning making. It was just a really wonderful, remarkable conference. Renee has also partnered with Case Western Reserve University for many years, hosting student exchanges and faculty exchanges. So Renee is going to present the chapter, Relational Practices, Generative Multi-Actor Collaboration, and then he will be joined by Barbara Lewis.
Well, the central concept I want to document is in fact the chapter, the title of the chapter that we wrote, Relational Practices for Generative Multi-Actor Collaboration. Well, it's this concept is in fact the concept that became the connecting principle and the connecting practice for different fields and works we are involved in. And I'm speaking in the name of the different authors here. In that chapter, there is an illustration by Mark Krabs and Art de Wulf about a project of the development process in Ecuador. And in Ecuador, it's a multi-actor project of developing nature reserves and developing also local working communities. And those are multi-actor processes. In the beginning, we are using the concept of multi-party collaboration, but parties, as that was Barbara Gray who introduced this concept. Multi-party is more kind of conflictual political parties fighting with each other. But we started to use the concept of multi-actor collaboration, and Mark and Art, together with Enrique Santos in Ecuador, in Cuenca, they developed a whole series of inter-actor collaboration of developmental work, of nature reserve, collaboration with farmers, non-governmental organizations, and local communities. The second author I want to introduce is Tarsi Tailleux, who is a colleague of me of the university. And Tarsi was involved in innovation projects in organizations, in mainly business organizations or social organizations. And he used the multi-actor concept for collaborations among different business actors. And like the other concepts were Koen Sips, he used one of the co-authors, he used the concept to work with different local community projects, and he introduced it as LETS projects, and that's projects local exchange and trading systems. It was a project of where different actors work together with each other. And Johan Hovelink, who is the first author of the chapter, in fact, he is working as a community development person, a social consultant also, action researcher, and he made his PhD on social community projects. So from very different perspectives, from small groups, organizational development, inter-organizational, societal projects, the common practice was the quality of the relational practice. And the quality of the relational practice means giving meaning to the differences. It's dealing with the differences and giving names and creating meaning among the differences in such a way that connecting practices become possible. And therefore, we started to develop the concept CCC, contacting, confronting, committing. Contacting is building among actors, and those actors can be representatives of different kinds of groups and of work contexts. Contacting is elaborating the differences and looking for the differences and see what the differences are possible. And we combine it with an appreciative mode also, that you appreciate what is possible, what are the possibilities of the differences to connect and to make meaning with each other. Making meaning is the first step. And then when you make meaning about things, you can confront what are the differences that can be combined, which differences cannot be included, which structures have we to develop. So that's the second step. Contacting, confronting, and then committing is to develop projects, to develop designs, to develop time references and so on, so that the projects can be deployed. So the quality of the relational practice became the connecting concept, and we were very grateful there for the concept of social constructionism. And for me, I discovered social constructionism as a very vital concept beyond the classical organization theory, or even I grew up as a T-group trainer and as an organization development person, and then social constructionism and my visit to Cleveland and so on gave me the opportunity to see how social constructionism and the quality of the relational practices is the key concept. And therefore, we want to put that in the center of our chapter, the model of the 3 C's: contacting, confronting, committing. And I want to invite Barbara to react, because I can go on talking about it for hours, I think.
Well, and Renee, I feel like I could spend hours just asking you questions about the model, and also the examples that you give about sustainable drinking water. My background's actually in community engagement, so the multi-actor collaboration was close to home. My favorite sentence from your chapter was, connecting is a precondition for generative confrontation, and the interplay between connecting and confronting sets the stage for commitment. And I think it's that emphasis on commitment that is so important. I wonder if you could just talk about, one of the things you said in the Andes example was that they came up with a new governance model, but when they tried to replicate it in other settings, they found it didn't work unless the replication was generative, unless the multi-actors created the governance. I wonder if you could just talk about that.
Is there a specific example you want to refer to?
Yes, you said that they came up with a whole new governance model, but then they tried to use it in different settings. And what they learned was they needed to engage the people in those settings in generating that governance model. And I thought that was really an interesting insight in terms of the generative development of commitment.
Well, it has a lot to do with how people define differences, because at this moment in the world is full of differences, and we are confronted with it in this COVID crisis.
Yes.
Are differences really differences that people are different, or and some people see differences as a given, and we have to negotiate, or we have to reconstruct or change the differences. But I think the core is to develop with the differences a kind of a combination, and that you develop a common practice, a design, a scheme, a concept, a tool, an image maybe, a painting, so where the differences can be integrated. So there is this strong belief that differences can be integrated. And I think that's a kind of a belief that's even above the direct observation that people have, because there is this, you have to be who you are. In psychology, there has been always this tendency, be what you are, and of self-confirmation. And I see this.
I'm going to jump in here. Again, try to politely manage the time.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Renee and Barbara. And this notion of differences is such an important one. We're getting questions about it, and we know that giving people their voice means, as Renee said, healthy individuals really having ways to bring about differences. I'd like to now introduce Danielle Zandy, who, again, it's just a delight. I've known Danielle since she was a graduate student, and she is now a professor working with lots of other graduate students. She is at, I have it written down somewhere, in the Netherlands, University in the Netherlands. Her work as a professor in organization development change focuses on appreciative inquiry and action learning. The chapter called Zooming In on Microdynamics of Social Innovation, Enabling Novelty, through relational constructionist practices. Danielle, please.
Thank you, Diana. And yes, we do know one another for a very long time, also through the images and voices of hope. I hold a chair in the Netherlands at Nyenrode Business University in Breukelen. That's actually called Sustainable OD. And hence I have an interest in combining organizational development, knowledge and practice and skills with the agenda of sustainability and creating a more just and socially sustainable global society. I focus there on social innovation, so the social aspect of sustainability. And my question is how organizational development can actually play a very active role in enabling processes of social innovation. I really believe in that. I also believe that organizational development as such, as a field, will also have to innovate in order to fully grasp that role and that responsibility. I talk about social innovation in this chapter, and I use a definition of colleagues of mine in the Netherlands in, actually it's this definition. They say that social innovation is changing social relations. So the relational is at the core of social innovation. But then they also say, Avelino et al., that it involves new ways of doing, of organizing, of framing, and of knowing. And I find it a very helpful framing of social innovation, also for social constructionist practice, linkages to framing, knowing, etc. My premise is that if organization development wants to enable social innovation, it can do so from a relational constructionist stance. I borrow there actually from Renee Bowen and his colleagues in focusing on and making the relating and how we relate basically primary in whether or not we can create innovation. I also say that organizational development needs to be issue focused, and I will come back to that in the end. And I want to basically anchor our organizational development practices in the daily practice of the people with whom we work. So I take a micro stance towards social innovation. Often people approach it from an economic or from a political, social perspective. And I want to look at what really happens in the daily practice of people. So I take a micro stance. I find daily practice really important and interesting. I want to do my OD facilitation as close as possible to what people really actually do on a daily basis. I believe that there is wiggle room for change in daily practice, in the primary process, if we can help develop reflexive capacity. And I also borrow from the field of practice theory that basically looks at practices as the sayings and doings of people. And I find it very inspiring and informative to be able to combine the sayings, the talking, our constructionist kind of notion, with the doings, the actions. So it allows me to go beyond talk. In the chapter, I basically use the framing of social innovation on two different examples. One is about citizen participation, very popular in the Netherlands, nowadays also sometimes called government participation, in search of municipal happiness. The other example is about healthcare transformation. In the citizen participation case, I will not go into it into detail, but the leading question there was, for instance, how might we have important conversations that we tend to avoid? In Holland, the notion of deep democracy is very popular at the moment. How might we have conversations together around our differences, around conflicts that go into the understream and that we want to bring out in order to create positive constructive change? And one of the things I learned from that case is that the identification of the issues that we want to work with in itself is already a social construction. We often take those issues for granted. But we can't. The other example was more from a critical appreciative lens and really brought forward the notion of how can we work with power differences. to end, because I already see Amanda, to end with what I learn about the innovation of organization development is that I say it needs to be issue focused. It makes it much more possible to be pragmatic in our methodological choices. We need to move beyond the limitations of the organization of organization development. We need to be much more sensitive, attentive to power dynamics and help to deconstruct those unhelpful power dynamics. And we can work on our own discursive agency to maybe interlock small scale local social innovations into much larger kinds of forms of societal change and transformation. Amanda, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Danielle. Like Barbara, I probably could spend the next half hour with you talking about this. But I want to explore the very last thing you just spoke about, and that is the interlocking of those smaller transformations to create broader transformation. You know, you're turning, we've got the two perspectives of macro to micro and then micro to macro. So talk a little bit about the connections that you imagine creating or that you have created.
Yeah, it's an important question and people are addressing it more and more, because you can think we make change at the highest level, and I'm not there. I really believe in small change, but then obviously that also comes from my action research orientation and really believing in situated contextual change. But then the next question is, if you really want to create social change, how do you connect all those smaller initiatives? I mentioned two examples, and both of them are, I think, quite popular. I just mentioned the discursive one. The other one is the growing idea of learning platforms. Creating spaces, and maybe from a dialogic perspective, creating containers where people from different local initiatives can come together, but not hierarchically organized learning platforms, but platforms where really people from practice, those who are involved with the innovation of sayings and doings, come together and share their different thoughts and insights and practices. That's one of the ways that I think we might be able. And there are some examples of how people are doing that.
Thank you both very, very much. Amanda, great question. Danielle, for me, a key point is, and I see there's some questions even in the chat box, how do we identify the issues and keep that issue focused? I think that's essential these days. So thank you both very much. I want to introduce now Hae-Sun Moon, who will really help us think about some of the macro activities in organizations. She's talking about her chapter, Coaching Using Ordinary Words in Extraordinary Ways. Hae-Sun is the director of solution-focused brief coaching program at the University of Toronto. She's involved with the Canadian Center for Brief Coaching, and I am so honored and delighted to say she's my co-author in our newest book, Thriving Women, Thriving World. Hae-Sun has a chapter in the book that offers us not just practices, but a model and perhaps the horizon of a new theory for how to look at some of these macro dynamics and interact with people as we coach them. Hae-Sun, welcome.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Talking with Jenny.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Hae-Sun, like saying hey to sun. And I kid you not, my last name is actually Moon. So it's a Hae-Sun Moon. It's a practical joke from my parents. Anyway, I work in communication science and I work as a researcher. And this whole idea of coaching actually became very popular in the last 20 years. Probably all of you have heard about it. Some of you are practicing it. But coaching, as the chapter title, is more as an empirical site. So whether you're teaching, facilitating, counseling, and all this different dialogic work, I hope this is relevant to you. Because about 20 years ago, when this practice of coaching became kind of popular, the question emerged. The question is, does it work? And that question triggered a lot of outcome studies, and they went back to people, did it work? Did it work? And now we have tons of outcome studies with one answer, yes, it does. That's great. Then it triggers another question.
And the question is, how does it work? Yes, we know it works, but how does it work? And when I interview people, when we actually look at all this research literature, there are so many answers to that. Some people say, well, the motivation changes, self-confidence is increasing, or some people say, well, it works by building empathy. And many people have different theories of change. Then the question that I then asked was, how do you know that? How do you know that that's what makes it work? And my favorite answer so far comes from a very well-known person in the field of coaching. I'm not going to give you the name, but he said, well, it works in mysterious ways. So when you say that kind of stuff to a researcher, you end up with a thesis, right? So it's an interesting thing. Whatever you do, if you're working in therapy, consulting, whatever it is, does it work? How does it work? How do you know that it works? So those three are the main questions that I talk about in the chapter. I start with the narrative. It's a very simple narrative, and we're looking at it from different perspectives. So not only we're defining coaching as a dialogic and relational approach, but also we look at how we make meaning together. And especially the role of language is very much accentuated. And especially, how does question work? When we use questions, often the misunderstanding that coaching is all about questions. Well, it's not, but how does it work? And not only that, how do our responses work? The things that we do in our formulations, how does that work? So in response to that, there's a very simple heuristic of interaction that I'm introducing in the chapter. And it goes like this. If you think about a conversation that you just had with somebody that you are wondering how it went, you can kind of map it on this map. And the map is from left to right. In anyone's narrative, you can probably hear them talk about something that happened in the past and something that might happen in the future. So left to right is past to future. So it's a timeline. And top to bottom is intersecting that left to right. Top is people tell you what they like, what they want, and we call it positive content. And also people tell you, that's on the top. On the bottom, people will tell you what they don't like, what they don't want. And it's interesting, when you put them together, you have a quadrant. So we have an opportunity to map somebody's narrative on it and really look at what they want in the future, which what we call prefer future, what they liked from the past, which is called resourceful past, what they didn't like from the past, which is troubled past, or maybe even traumatic past, and what they are kind of dreading in the future, which is dreaded future. So with this map, we were able to really make this meaning making visible. So that's the model in there. And I think one of the things that I really love about doing this work is how do we really witness like this new subjective meaning kind of emerge in this collaborative sort of interfluence so that other narrative realities are made available. So that's the chapter. Hopefully you will enjoy it. Hey, I see Ginny. Hello.
Hello, hey son. I have to say, this chapter was so interesting to me in how simple and elegantly you were able to go from a sort of looking at time and content and creating a kind of heuristic or a map that then enabled people, your students or your coaches, to be able to develop questions towards their overall goal of coaching. And so when I was reading your chapter, I kept going back to, okay, so if this is the map, and you did, it was tied. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how this map you created, you know, these components relate to the goal of coaching, and how does it guide then the coach in their questioning?
You know, it's interesting because this is a very simple idea, as you say. It's almost like you're sitting with somebody in a coffee shop. You can actually use a napkin to draw the map and you can share it. It's such a napkinable idea. And what I see as an impact is that people can quickly take this heuristic, like the word heuristic comes from like eureka. So it's like, hey, I discovered it. So people start to discover what works in their conversations just simply using this tool. So, you know, as an educator, I realized that I actually have to do less work and less, the better they become familiar with this heuristic. So that's something that I find that people are finding it easier to share, easier to learn.
Mhm. Yes, and I'm also curious. Okay, if I have another minute, and Diana, cut me off if I don't.
Go ahead and ask one more question.
Okay.
I kind of went to the chat, so yes, go ahead.
Wondered what happened to the present, and if there's anything in this
I
work.
love it. Yes. What is the present? I'm kidding. So actually, in looking at this actually as a research model, there's a quadrant 0, which I don't talk about here. And that actually deals with the time that I have with this person in this dialogic space. That is actually considered as the now, or the quadrant 0. So thank you for asking.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
I now have an incredible honor to introduce Amanda Trosten-Bloom and Barbara Lewis, who are partners of the Rocky Mountain Center for Positive Change, 2 women who I've worked with extensively. Amanda is one of the leaders in large-scale transformation, how to engage the whole system. Barbara has been working with the field of participatory planning and appreciative in how do you engage whole communities, and their work with communities throughout Colorado is exemplary. I want to say to everyone that my introductions don't do service to any of these people. Please go on the Taos Institute website and look at their biographies as associates of the Taos Institute, or Google them. Amanda and Barbara will be presenting their chapter, Large Scale Appreciative Inquiry, New Futures Through Shared Conversations, and then Renee will join them with a question.
Thank you, Diana. So Barbara and I are incredibly over-prepared for this conversation, and we decided to use some slides to make sure that we could imprint some of what we're talking about with you all while we're speaking. So I'm going to share those slides with you, and we're going to go through our chapter giving you some highlights. We began by outlining 3 different approaches to large-scale appreciative inquiry. And these are shown on this slide. They're outlined in the book, The Power of Appreciative Inquiry. And we then went on to outline 7 different considerations for large-scale change that we believe enables the new futures to be unearthed. And we say that by adapting these processes to the surrounding context, large-scale AI attends to some of the issues of concern to social constructionists. And these included engaging people whose voices are not heard, enabling trusting, collaborative relationships across diverse and sometimes dispersed systems, and then third, supporting people in creating shared knowledge and meaning. Because our time is limited, we've decided to just lean into 5 of these considerations. Excuse me, 4 of them that we've highlighted on this slide. I'm going to start by talking about who should be involved and why. Since large-scale AI involves hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, we need to intentionally identify the right people to participate. And we use a process called perspectives mapping to do this. Perspective mapping looks something like this. It enables the right people to be identified representing various demographics, levels, functions, and perspectives of people whose commitment is essential for implementation. An example we used in our chapter comes from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. They used perspectives mapping to identify and connect with members of the BIPOC community. And since many of those participants they were aiming for were currently disenfranchised with the institution as the project began, the process mapping also enabled them to identify who might best recruit them to the process and how they might be recruited.
And so we have who needs to be involved, but then we have to wrestle with how to engage them. And typically this involves moving beyond those who are inherently interested in an organization or a topic to others whose real life constraints may limit the ways in which they can participate. This is where organizing a whole system diverse planning team is invaluable, because the people involved know the best way to reach people in their networks. And they also know the variety of ways that we can meaningfully engage to fit people's lifestyles and preferences. We have ways to engage people, and that produces a lot of data at scale, and it's collected over time, and we need to engage a diverse group to collaboratively reflect on what the data says and it means. In the chapter, we talk about the Adams 12 school district, where 7,000 people participated. Now, how do you organize that data? In their instance, we give the example of they organized an online database with responses organized into 3 simple categories: strengths and stories, hopes and dreams, and big ideas. So the example that we're showing on the slide shows that they had participants entering real time into this database as the project evolved. They also did online surveys so they could reach an even broader audience. At scale, AI also occurs over a period of time, and new people may come into the process at different points. So you have to plan how to validate and build upon what came before. In Adams, this chart here shows how at each stage they were able to validate. The initial inquiries were validated through an online survey. They had an Elevate Summit, and there the core strengths were inquired into in the opening interviews. And they also used the hopes and ideas as the foundation for action planning in the focus groups. So we all often say that appreciative inquiry is an art form. It's not a recipe. And when done at scale, I'd say the artistry we've learned is even more important, and it's even more messy. As we engage large, diverse, and dispersed groups of people, the process needs to be fully adapted to what works best, both for the individuals and the whole. So we hope that the considerations in our chapter help improve the practice of doing appreciative inquiry at scale. And now I think we have Renee coming in to ask us a question.
So I'm surprised you left out your question 3, because that was the question I...
Well, good, perfect.
Question 3 and question 7. Those were the 2 critical questions for me. And you just left them out. But I think it has to do with which activities are connecting, or which elements are connecting. And question 3 has to do with where is what will connect people. And question 7 is, when you have a system, how does it fit to the larger environment? And but I'm just surprised that I just picked those 2 elements, and that you were commenting on one and 2, and then the more the doing with the people is important, of course, but to have it fit with the rest, I think, because I was looking for, how do you deal with the differences, and dealing with the differences in a connecting way. That was my question then.
So how do you deal with differences in a connecting way? So Amanda, why don't you start on that, and then I'll add 2.
Terrific. Well, the reason we left those 2 out is not that they're not important, they're all important.
Yeah.
But when dealing with the issue of connecting across differences, what we find is that the primary process for building that connection is that opening appreciative interview, which takes place in both small and large scale appreciative inquiry processes. It's that deep sense of, this is one of my oldest friends that I have known for my whole life, and we're so similar, comes out of that opening interview very often. And one of the things that we also wrestled with is the reality that in the virtual environment that we're in right now, that's becoming more important and maybe more difficult, because we find that as consultants are leveraging virtual technologies to connect people, large groups of people, they're sometimes keeping that upfront, deep, intimate, heart-based interview that is at the core of an appreciative process. And we're encouraging to go back to that.
Yeah.
And the only thing I'd add to that is, you know, one of our clients said that it's magical the way appreciative inquiry connects people who previously had a toxic relationship, who were diametrically opposed. She said, I don't understand how it does it, but it does. And I think what happens, and Amanda said that opening interview, but it's also the notion of max mix, of, you know, really attending to connecting people who don't expect to find common ground. And when they start the process finding common ground, then they're connecting through both their heart and their mind. And so there's the beginning of trust that develops in that interview.
Therefore, I found the seventh question that you put very important. You work with a group of people in this appreciative mode, but those people belong to organizations or to a larger environment. And it's afterwards to connect this experience when they go home, and how do they relate to the home experience. And that's I came up with my question, because I have been working a lot with appreciative inquiry, but then when they go home and they have to start to start to practice the same way with their bosses or with their subordinates when they come home. That was my question still. So that it's the practice. How can they bring home the appreciative practice and the connection that you create by interacting in an appreciative way?
Got it.
Well, and you know what we found in our processes is the actual process itself teaches them new ways of engaging people. So it starts to shift the way the organization functions. So that is oftentimes why Amanda mentioned Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I think they've done 6 new initiatives since our initial work with them, because they believe in appreciative inquiry and they see other ways it can happen. So now, instead of affecting just the few hundred who were involved initially, they've affected most of their organization. Amanda, what would you like to add to that? I see don't get to add.
Thank you all for these amazing presentations and your patience with my interruption. Great. I think we're really seeing themes here. I now want to introduce our final author presenter today. And I must say that when I was organizing the chapters in the book and when I was organizing the presentations today, I could make a logic for putting Jervis and his chapter first, because it is in many ways a preview of what's to come. But I can also make a case for putting it as I have toward the end, because in his research, he has summarized and brought together the key issues from so many different practices. And again, we're going to hear from him. In many ways, it's going to hit the pulse of much of what has been said. So Jervis Bush, who is a professor of leadership and organization development at Simon Fraser University, a book, Clear Leadership, and a consulting practice that is built upon that, has, with his co-author Bob Marshak, really challenged and changed the field of organization development with this notion of dialogic organization development. And so he's going to talk about the chapter Social Construction and the Practice of Dialogic Organization Development. Jervis, please unmute so we can hear your wondrous ideas. And he will be joined by his son.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. Bob Marshak, who can't be here today, sends his regards to all of you. And as many of you know, Bob and I have been, for the past 15 years, trying to look under the hood at so many of the innovations in OD that have happened since the mid-1980s, appreciative inquiry being one of the seminal ones. And when we thought about what this chapter was going to be about, we assumed this would be read by people who were interested in social constructionism and knew nothing about organization development. So that's who the chapter is for. And so we start out by arguing that there are 5 core characteristics of organization development that have endured for the past 60 years. whether you use a diagnostic approach or a dialogic approach. And that's what, contrasts it with something like change management. And then the rest of the chapter, for most of you here are familiar with dialogic OD, there's not much new. We just go over kind of the ideas that we've been writing about for the past 15 years. The one thing that may be a little bit new is a new model we've developed, and since a picture is worth 1,000 words, I'm going to show it to you. And this is what we call the generative change model. And this emerged when I was trying to teach Saudi Arabian mining engineers to use dialogic OD, and it worked. By the next day, they were designing generative change processes to use in their minds. So, things like these kind of models are, for those of us who understand OD, always overly simplistic, but kind of try to capture what I think is going on. And you could think of this as a hypothesis. Now, when we look at all sorts of different generative change approaches, dialogic change approaches, the ones that truly are transformative, I think, go through this kind of process. And there are two aspects to it I'd highlight. And one is this reframing whatever it is we're doing into a purpose statement. I think, and you just saw that in Amanda and Barbara's presentation as well, this idea that we need to focus the change on something people really care about. And I think, and when you look at the ones, the changes that have been most transformational, they've used this thing I call a generative image. And so the contrast would be like saying, our change process is about how to create a flourishing organization. It's it's not a very generative image for most people, compared to something like, how do we create extraordinary intergender working relationships, which, has all these qualities of a generative image of being ambiguous, kind of wet, but attractive, likely to pull people in. And the other, I'd say, contribution to this model is really identifying that when these change processes are really transformational, and by that I mean big changes happen in a rapid manner, what happens is, rather than using a set of generative conversations to then, give a set of proposals, to some authorities or managers or something, who then go away to do something with it, and you're back to an implementation problem with all the sort of resistances that creates. These are most transformational when what happens at the end of an event or an AI summit or whatever is people are encouraged to just go do it. There may be some guardrails have been put up, but there's no attempt by authorities to pick winners, and the whole role of leadership changes substantially as a result of that. So, shameless plug, this is covered in my latest book in a lot more detail, The Dynamics of Generative Change, and I'm going to invite Hasun to come in, and curious to hear what you have to say.
Wow. So, I lost sleep last night rereading this because of excitement. And I have a few questions for you. So I'm going to actually ask them all. And you pick one or two that you would like to. Is that okay? I have questions.
I love it. That's all.
So, here's the thing. I think a lot of times we have consultants who are working internally to the system, and also people who are external to the system. And I think I'm so curious about maybe your experience about that, and also maybe some tips that you may have for both internal and external. Question number two is, when I was reading, I thought, can this be done in a very thick hierarchical sort of organization such as government, or even nowadays higher education? So stories around it, maybe your insights about it. So that's another one. Last question is this. You speak about system to be developed, and you speak about those three kind of examples. And I thought, system to be developed, is that more like a condition for this to happen, or is that more like also effect of doing this, or maybe even both? So any of those questions, please.
Thank you. Those are all great questions. Briefly, I'd say on the argument around that organization development is about development, I would say those are results of the intervention. Right? Increasing rationality and increasing capacity to actualize potential. So yeah, those are outcomes. Those aren't inputs. on government higher ed, the thing about a generative change approach is you need to have leaders who can say, I don't know what the answer is, but I know what the problem is. And I'm going to hold that space of not knowing and invite stakeholders in. And it's very difficult in government to find politicians who will do that, right? Typically, they won't lead something until it's already successful. And I've run into this in some of my consulting work with government, and I don't know how to get around that. Whereas in higher education, the big problem there is you put a bunch of professors in a room and everyone thinks they're the smartest person in the room and everyone's got a different opinion. So at BD, we've just gone through an attempt to use a generative change process to make some changes, and some things happen, but you know, I think higher education is the most resistant form of organization on the planet. So we could have a long conversation about that. The question of internal versus external consultants, there's no question it's a different world for both. And I've had experiences both, but mostly as an external. And a lot of my work as an external in a generative change process is working the relationship. So we're always back to this thing, relationships, particularly between the internal change agents and the sponsors, and really shaping that relationship into something that's quite different from a project. So you know, and as an external, I show up with a whole different set of status, rank, you know, the social construction around me is quite different from what's going on with the internals. And it gives me a lot of opportunities to be influential in ways they can't. And a lot of my work is about how do I help to, you know, move the influence of the change agents in the system. So thank you for those questions.
Thank two of you.
Thank you.
Dawn, can I have a
nice to meet you, Hazel.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Jervis and Hazel. Thank you to all of the authors. I mean, I find this, I still am learning. I wish I could rewrite the summary of all the chapters. One of the things that I want to point out as I've listened, and it's very important to me, and I think to many of the authors, the issue, as Danielle calls it, the purpose statement, as Jervis calls it, the topic for the appreciative inquiry, as Amanda talked about it with Barbara, the content of an organizational process is as important as how we talk about it. When we're going into organizations, I think Jervis kind of did, oh, flourishing, blah. You know, we're now living in a world where there's a sort of meta conversation about happiness is good and strengths are good, and there's all of these shorthands. But those of us who are working deep in organizations and are helping organizations face the power dynamics, face their role in the sustainability of our planet, face their role in social justice, are really inviting people to take on these hard topics and have a purpose that itself is transformative. Not that it will be the end result, but it will be an organizing principle for conversations. And I am wondering, we've got a little bit of time left. Let me look, we've got about 8 minutes left. And I'm wondering, Amanda, you and Barbara were looking at questions. Do we have a question from someone in the audience that the authors can address?
There were a couple that I identified that I'd like to call out, but first, this one goes back to Lona's original presentation, and it was from Carlos Aguilera Muga, and he asked about how the new virtual environment allows or limits body engagement practice, and I thought that would be an interesting one to take on.
Thank you very much. I think it's very relevant for all of us sitting here talking about how do we engage relationally and through online ways. I myself, I am very challenged as a university teacher. How do I engage with my students in a relational, responsive way through the screen? It's very hard, I think. I mean, I think all of you, we try out different ways of engaging responsively with the people online trying to create small rooms for conversation and trying to be clear in making a kind of contract before we start the teaching. I often ask my students to help me in looking at the chat function, or help me when people are raising their hand, so it will not just turn into a monologue from my side. I teach a lot of master students who are mature students who have a lot of experience from their own working life, and they are very eager to contribute to the teaching session, even though it's online, with their own professional experience. So it's not that hard, but I find it much harder to teach younger students who may not have so much experience yet to contribute with. I don't know if that was a kind of answer to the question, but it's hard, and I'm actually very critical towards all kinds of online webinars and seminars. I would prefer to meet people face to face. Yeah.
Barbara, have you discovered an interesting question for us in our chat?
Yes, when Jenny was speaking, Steve Lawler asked, what are some of the ways that an appreciative approach best engages community-level anti-racism work?
So let's ask that of Jenny, and then if there's any other authors who want to address that, because it is indeed an important topic right now.
That's an area of work I've been doing a lot of recently, and I think that in my mind, I think sometimes we have limited the concept of appreciative practice to what's only positive, and I think that's a false interpretation of what appreciative work is really all about. And so I think when it comes to working with really deep differences and with really tough conflicts, we need to learn how to sort of stay in the tension of that and really appreciate the differences that we bring. And I think what makes that tough is that it gets personal, and that becomes very hard. And we don't have a lot of good practices. And I think a lot of the skill building in relationship work is learning how to manage ourselves in deep difference. I think it's more critical in some ways right now than some of the work we've done around identifying strengths and positivity, because it's sort of erupting. Certainly in my work, I see it erupting everywhere. And learning how to really sit in the tension of difference, I think, is key, and appreciate it. So
appreciate it. I want to invite all the authors to turn yourself off of mute in case you want to join this conversation. Is there someone else who wants to add to this?
I would love to add just a couple of things, Jeannie, as you talk about the differences. I think what's very common and prominent out there is dialectic approaches to this conversation, that differences are something to be resolved or reconciled, whereas we need to add the dialogic dimension, which is how do we put these differences to work? So I think that's something that I'm actually really thinking about these days. We work with differences, but we put that to work rather than trying to resolve it. So it's an interesting perspective.
And not trying to reach agreement or sameness, but to really recognize that we can move forward in difference. But we have to be able to acknowledge people's experience. And I think that until that happens, people often get louder and louder with that experience. And I think that's been a big problem right now in working with racism and institutionalized racism in our organizations.
And we can certainly add to that all of the kinds of biases that people experience. Having an opportunity to really deepen conversations that allow people to talk about the biases they experience, and bring that into conversations. I'm wondering, does anyone else want to respond to this important question, or do we have another question? Amanda, did you come up with another question for us from our chat?
Yeah, there were a couple of other questions that were interesting here. One it was for Jervis, wondering about you briefly referenced, Jervis, the changes in leadership that need to take place once people start self-organizing.
Yeah.
And wondering if you might speak to that one.
Sure. Yeah, there's, I think, a lot of action going on right now in the leadership space around this, agile leadership, adaptive leadership. I'm calling it generative leadership. There's lots of different names for it as we try to figure this out. And what I've been writing about, I was studying a guy who's my poster boy for generative leadership, who was running before he retired a kind of a social enterprise conglomerate out of Seattle in the space of people with developmental disabilities and employing them in organizations where they were creating competitive advantage. It was an amazing, amazing thing to study and watch what he does. And his level of vertical development, his ability to live in paradox and see it and surf it was just stunning to me. And as I was studying him, one of his one of the directors of his organization went to the board and said, "This guy is a terrible leader. You need to fire him." And and what I realized is that at that moment, like, for many of us, what leadership means is you can tell me the answer. I come to you and I say, "What should I do?" And you should be able to tell me. And if you can't tell me, what the hell, why are you the leader? Why are we paying you? And that narrative of leadership exists up and down the hierarchy, So we need a completely new narrative of leadership if we're going to support the kind of relationally responsive organizations we're talking about. And so these generative change kind of things, because right now,
Thank you, Jervis. That is just to the point. I'm aware that we are hitting our time limit here. I want to say thank you to the authors both for the time you put in writing your chapters, the editing and rewriting that I asked you along with Celiane, who was my editor point person. It's been just a delight working with all of you. And as I said in the beginning, this really is a high point for the Taos Institute to bring this book forth with your work and the work of all of the chapters. So Dawn, I want to turn it back over to you to wrap up our session. Thank you all.
Wonderful. I want to thank all the authors. Thank you, Diana, for this engaging hour and a half together. We have recorded this call. We will make it available on our Taos Institute Learning platform. So I will send an email after this call to everyone who registered with the link to access the video. Our next dialogue with the author for the Sage Handbook of Social Construction is going to be on April 23rd. Thalia Dragonis from Greece is the editor of that section, and the section is Practices in Education. So we hope you all register for that one and come and enjoy the dialogue with the authors on April 23rd. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn the spotlights off so we could see everybody. If everybody would just like to stay on a minute, and we'll get back to seeing everybody on the call. It just takes a minute to do this. Review.
Wow.
It's good to see everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Diana.
Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye.